Welcome to the Natural Cycle. This is a channel where we attempt to solidify the absolute. We appreciate you tuning us in. Thanks for joining us. Most people think they are dealing with a person in a relationship. They frame it through emotion, communication, and mutual understanding. But some relational systems do not behave like mutual systems at all. They behave more like controlled environments where structure matters more than connection. In software engineering, a controlled environment is something like a Node.js project managed by NPM or a Python environment managed by pip. These systems do not simply install software. They regulate what can exist inside the system. They control compatibility. They enforce versions, they resolve conflicts, and they prevent instability by limiting change. The system is not emotional, it is structural. Its goal is stability, not truth or freedom. This analogy becomes useful when examining certain psychological dynamics, where one person begins to function as a kind of system controller. Not in a literal technical sense, but in the way behavior, identity, and emotional feedback become structured through repeated interaction patterns rather than mutual exchange. To understand this, we start with a basic principle from cognitive science. The brain does not experience reality directly, it predicts it. This is the foundation of predictive processing theory, developed by researchers like Carl Friston. The brain is constantly building internal models of the world and updating them based on feedback. George Kelly's theory of personal constructs describes a similar idea. Humans act like scientists testing internal models of reality. When those models are stable, behavior feels stable. When they are not, the mind prioritizes reducing uncertainty. Now imagine a relational environment where feedback is inconsistent but patterned. Not random, but structured in a way that creates emotional instability. In that environment, the brain begins to prioritize predictability over accuracy. It would rather maintain a flawed but stable model than constantly rebuild itself. This is where the analogy begins to resemble a package management system. In systems like NPM, dependencies are installed based on compatibility rules. If one package requires a specific version of another, the system enforces that relationship. If conflicts arise, the system resolves them in ways that preserve overall stability. Now translate this into identity. In certain relational dynamics, behaviors and traits begin to function like dependencies. Confidence, independence, emotional expression, and disagreement become components that are either accepted or rejected based on system response. Over time, a subtle pattern emerges. Certain versions of the self are rewarded, while others create instability. A compliant version feels smoother in the system. An independent version triggers conflict, withdrawal, or disruption. This creates pressure that is not explicitly stated, but consistently reinforced. Leon Festinger's theory of cognitive dissonance explains part of this process. When people experience contradiction between internal belief and external feedback, they attempt to reduce the tension. In unstable environments, this often happens by adjusting perception rather than changing the environment. This is where identity begins to function like version control. In software systems like Git, changes are tracked over time. Developers can revert, branch, or rewrite history depending on system needs. In relational terms, individuals may experience similar pressure. Statements like "you were better before" or "this isn't like you" function like rollback signals. They are not neutral observations. They are versioning instructions. They define which version of the self is considered acceptable within the system. At the same time, dependency begins to form. In software, dependencies are external modules required for a system to function. In psychology, dependency often takes the form of emotional regulation. Attachment theory, developed by John Bowlby and Mary Ainsworth, shows that humans rely on attachment figures for emotional stability. In secure systems, this regulation is consistent. In insecure systems, it becomes conditional. Emotional stability begins to depend on external feedback rather than internal regulation. Approval becomes stabilizing. Disapproval becomes destabilizing. Behavioral psychology adds another layer. B.F. Skinner demonstrated that intermittent reinforcement creates the strongest behavioral persistence. When rewards are unpredictable, the nervous system becomes more engaged, not less. This principle is visible in behavioral addiction research and even in digital system design. In relational dynamics, it appears as cycles of closeness and withdrawal, approval and rejection, connection and distance. The unpredictability strengthens attention and emotional investment, not because of choice, but because of conditioning. In software systems, when instability appears, developers often do not rebuild the system. They patch it. Hotfixes are applied. Temporary solutions restore functionality without changing the underlying structure. In relational systems, similar cycles occur. Conflict builds, then repair happens. Then relief follows, then stability returns temporarily, but the underlying pattern remains unchanged. The system continues to operate through repetition rather than transformation. This is where the distinction between interface and backend becomes critical. In software, the interface is what the user sees: buttons, visuals, and interactions. The backend is what actually controls logic and behavior. In relational dynamics, the interface is emotional experience: affection, apology, intensity, connection, and conflict resolution. The backend is the structural pattern that governs how those experiences are produced. Paul Watzlawick's work on communication theory emphasizes that all behavior is communication within a system. Even emotional expression carries structural information. As time continues, the system becomes more integrated, not only externally, but internally. Emotional baselines begin to adjust to the pattern. Expectations become shaped by repetition. Identity begins to align with the feedback environment. This creates what systems theory would call deep coupling. When two systems become tightly interdependent, separation creates instability. This is why exit does not feel purely logical. It feels destabilizing. The system is not just something you leave. It is something you have adapted to internally. At this stage, the most important realization is structural, not emotional. Systems do not need to force behavior through direct control. They only need to maintain consistency. Consistency creates predictability. Predictability creates adaptation. Adaptation creates dependency, and dependency reduces the perceived possibility of exit. This is the full arc of the metaphor. A package manager does not care about emotion. It cares about compatibility. It enforces rules that maintain system stability. In this analogy, the relational dynamic behaves in a similar way, not as a conscious machine, but as a structured pattern of feedback, reinforcement, and control that organizes identity over time. Once you see the structure clearly, interpretation changes. Behavior stops appearing random. Patterns stop appearing emotional. And what remains is the distinction between interface and system, between experience and structure, between a person and the environment that shaped how you were allowed to function inside. Thank you for watching The Natural Cycle. Please hit the thumbs up, share, like, and subscribe. Until next time, enjoy.